In this section, we will discuss certain best practices related to fairness in healthcare AI and machine learning. We describe the machine learning cycle from the perspective of stakeholders. While designing the model, one should have a diverse and a representative set of stakeholders to review the model, uh, evaluate initiatives which may be interacted with the proposed model workflow, how does things get affected downstream, and what different ethical concerns with respect to the model use or misuse that different stakeholders may have. When it comes to data collection, then determining which features and which patient groups should be considered. Uh, are the protected groups being affected? Should surrogates be used? And if they are surrogates with respect to the target variable, then what is their relationship? What could go wrong? Um, is the protected group being adequately represented in the data? When it comes to training, then, well, one has to apply whatever relevant techniques with respect to pre-processing and processing or post-processing, whatever is necessary, as we have described previously. When it comes to evaluation, then engaging with stakeholders is extremely important. One can even expand that to patient group representatives, data scientists, machine learning experts, and just focusing on and determining which process will be affected by different model outputs. Um, and so the job is not just done at the model evaluation part. So once the model deploys, then another set of concerns appears. So it should be constantly monitored, periodically checked with the relevant stakeholders regarding even how the model is affecting them. And so when we talk about AI audits, uh, then from the perspective of model risk management, then it's important to have periodic lookbacks to evaluate the performance, the consequences of the models and deployment, have a set of internal and external processes to address that. Uh, and beyond that, there could even be domain-specific standard auditing processes. So look for comprehensiveness, scalability, um, and when it comes to auditing, then, I mean, there are challenges with respect to, well, how to deal with issues related to data quality for race, ethnicity, um, data missingness, so on and so forth. It is important to know that unfair practices do not exist in a vacuum. They are embedded in a larger context of historical, social, and political realities. Uh, And as we mentioned previously, measures of algorithmic bias assume that an algorithm which is fair in the abstract would be fair in the real world. And that's seldom going to be true. Um, for many of the outcomes, there are centuries of injustices which continue to permeate society and continue to be responsible for race and gender-based inequality. That said, we should recognize that these things cannot be fixed overnight. Uh, These may be very difficult to recognize, impossible to adjust for. So an optimal solution from that perspective may not be possible, but a solution which improves the status quo, that should be something that we should be aiming for. Beyond the model itself, just allocation of services, especially those which are derived from machine learning models, they should be continuously evaluated, audited for evidence of bias. This is just to ensure that they are delivered equally across protected groups and subgroups. That said, there is a complicating factor, which is that in general, the allocation of healthcare services will be determined by how clinicians or other end users interact with the model. So we can ask questions like, well, is there a disparate impact? Is there opportunity cost? Is there automation bias? so on and so forth. Which brings us to the concept of ethics washing. It's a concept that has become relatively prominent in the last few years, which is that the use of ethics to skirt regulation or defining ethics as something very narrow and shallow so that it does not really have much real world impact, or in other words, does not really come in the way of business. So some of the prominent issues in this regard are as follows. Reductionism, or doing the morally right thing, is essentially the same as acting in a fair way, or transparent, or just, or whatever. And so defining that being ethical is the same as being fair, or saying that in order to make ethical principles practical and action guiding, we need to distill that into a set of user-friendly compliance checklist. So in the context of fairness, that would be that, well, if you have this checklist, then your model is going to be fair. So this is a misuse of simplicity. Then there's the concept of relativism in this context, which is that just stating that since we all disagree on what is morally valuable, so it's pointless to imagine that there could be something universal baseline against which we can measure our moral choices. And so there's just not use in creating ethical systems. Then there's the dichotomy that the goal of ethical reasoning is to be ethical or become ethical. As you can see, this is blatantly false because it leaves out the practical aspects. There's value alignment, which says that, well, if relativism is wrong, then there must be one morally right answer. And we just need to find the right answer and ensure that everybody in our organization is aligned with that. As is evident here, this can be used to marginalize certain voices and opinions. The myopia trap is that ethical trade-offs that one identifies in one context are going to be the same trade-offs in another context. So the nature and the scope of the trade-off is going to be the same. The rule of law trap, on the other hand, is saying that ethics is essentially the same as rule of law. So if you don't have legal categories or legislation or regulation for governance of AI, then ethics is a good substitute. And on the flip side, when we do have sufficient legal frameworks, then we don't really need to think about ethics. So the question comes, well, how do we address many of these conundrums described here? And so one way to think about it is in terms of design thinking or design principles, that the manner in which we think about the machine learning process, we think about that in terms of uh, having a fairness aware design principle. So when we are gathering and pre-processing data, then pairing data scientists with domain experts or social scientists, depending upon your use case, exercising additional caution when, let's say, annotating data, let's say, model building and deployment part, ensuring that uh, balanced representation of different classes are present, having critical mass of instances when building model, having debiasing in mind, so on and so forth. And so revisiting the issue of labels, consider the following. So suppose we observe the following, that in general, black patients cost less. So one way to interpret the data is that black patients' poor care is the result of patients' non-compliance and lack of trust. While on the other hand, another and more correct way to interpret the data is that black patients are valued less, structural and interpersonal racism are persistent in the healthcare system, which are responsible for these outcomes. So we can generalize this observation to predictions in machine learning and AI in general, that uh, predictions or the target variables or even proxy variables, they can have different semantic interpretations. And so that affects the outcome and how we think about these things. So we can look at the predictions and then same prediction regarding non-compliance. And we can also say that if only companies, institutions, and individuals provided the same level of care for Black patients, then outcomes could be improved. And so part of that is having a human-centered design way of thinking about these problems. So to reiterate, so engaging a diverse set of potential users, employing a variety of different use case scenarios, disclosing your data collection process, and favoring user control over automation in general. And well, even be prepared for potentially adverse or even problematic feedback, because that's how you improve processes and outcomes. And another very important thing to emphasize that can get lost in this discussion regarding fairness, equality, and minimizing differences is that differences do not always entail inequality. In some cases, one can incorporate differences between groups into the model itself. So, for example, this quote from this paper, that biological differences between genders can affect the efficacy of pharmacological compounds. Additionally, biological differences may exist between groups, but establishing those require rigorous studies, since past science on racial differences is tainted by blatant racism. So a very important call out. Uh, and so one really important thing to emphasize is that, uh, again, from McCraden, that in many cases it's difficult to distinguish between acknowledging difference and propagating discrimination. So various principles with respect to how to concretely do that have been proposed. So one such is the FAIR set of principles. So findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, uh, and the context of fairness. So that's relevant in terms of ensuring that we have established data provenance, accessibility, and auditability of data. Machine actionability comes when we talk about the capacity of computational systems to find, access, and reuse data with none or minimal human intervention. To weave a few threads related to fairness in the context of deployment of machine learning system, consider the following. So when we think about machine learning systems, in a lot of cases, we just think about the machine learning model, while in reality, the machine learning model is just one small component of a very large IT infrastructure uh, responsible for, let's say, feature extraction, data collection, verification, configuration, process management tools, so on and so forth. So continuously monitoring the pipeline for various things like, let's say, does the training test data and the deployment data, do they match? Generating user reports for fairness and performance metrics. How do the values for fairness metrics evolve over time? Triggers when values go before certain thresholds, so on and so forth. And in addition to that, just having diverse stakeholders to audit systems for fairness, tools, and for determining whether there is data drift, periodically auditing the systems for these various things, and just having a database of user complaints, for example. Another place where fairness becomes complicated is how the general public thinks about fairness. Uh, so because fairness metrics and fair models are likely to be used by non-experts, so it's important to determine what is an average person's understanding of fairness. And so there have been studies which have found that comprehension is lower for equal opportunity false negative rates than for other definitions. Additionally, education is a strong predictor for comprehension of fairness metrics. But the implication for that is that marginalized groups, which are likely to be more affected and also likely to be less educated, um, will have less opportunity to understand these metrics and know that how they are being affected. So this one conclusion from this paper by Saha and others is that weakest comprehension of fairness metrics also express the least negative sentiment towards them. And so if we really think about it, that is a worrisome conclusion. The current discussion leads to the natural question: how should algorithms be regulated? One way to think about is to make an analogy with how drugs are regulated. So think about the various elements, side effects. So, for example, chemotherapy drugs can shrink a patient's tumor, but they can also have devastating side effects. Uh, they can have different effects on different populations. For example, for a particular blood thinner, that does not work in 75% of Pacific Islanders because their bodies do not produce the enzyme for drug activation. Understanding who the product is for. So clinical researchers are required to clearly define a drug's target users uh, so that a prescribing clinician can have confidence that the drug has been successfully tested on similar patients. Understanding how the product was developed. Clinical trials have mandatory reporting requirements to ensure transparency, to hold product developers accountable. Uh, so maybe we do need an FDA for ML algorithms and AI in general. If you really think about it, in drug development, FDA enforces protocols for manufacturers. So they have to prove the safety and effectiveness of drug products before they can go onto the market. Um, when in a nutshell, one part of the problem is that uh, algorithms and ML models, they just don't come up with warning labels. Then maybe we do need warning labels. Maybe you need something like adverse effects. So, for example, drugs carry the risk of adverse effects, so like injury, hospitalization, etc. So, well-documented public reporting structure for handling such mishaps exists as prescribed by the FDA. So, where reports of serious events like death, serious injury can be tracked. So, finally, the proposals towards that effect, they are coming into play. So, the field is moving and evolving. And to wrap up this section, there are few open questions and challenges that one should be mindful of. Um, and questions like, which measures of fairness are most appropriate for a given context? When is disparity between groups acceptable and why? So many of these questions may not be possible to generalize these, but at least for certain, let's say, classes of scenarios, it may be possible to address that. What kind of, let's say, trade-offs end users or decision makers should consider, so on and so forth. And then there are questions which are really hard questions, like many aspects of fairness are which are not captured by metrics or data. How do we address those? Do we need additional data? What kind of data should be collected? Um, Larger, more systematic questions like how relevant should the past, future, or intergeneration injustices be? Again, these are not easy questions with easy answers, but again, something to ponder.